The Golden Gate Bridge had always stood as one of America's most iconic landmarks. For decades, its fiery red arches had stretched across the San Francisco Bay, carrying cars, buses, and pedestrians while serving as a symbol of hope, progress, and resilience. It was more than just steel and cables, it was history woven into the skyline. But in every community, there's always someone who looks at something beloved and decides it doesn't fit their personal definition of acceptable. In this story, that person was a woman named Karen. Karen wasn't just any neighbor. She was the type of person who believed rules existed only when they benefited her. She had lived in San Francisco long enough to know the rhythms of the city, but unlike most who marveled at the bridge, she saw it as an eyesore. She claimed it blocked the view, ruined the aesthetic, and even invited too many tourists into the area. To her, the bridge wasn't a marvel, it was a nuisance. And in true Karen fashion, she wasn't content with just complaining about it to friends or posting angry rants online. She decided to take matters further. The story began when Karen attended a neighborhood meeting, the kind where locals gathered to discuss small issues: trash collection, noise complaints, occasional property disputes. Most people came in with minor frustrations, hoping for resolutions. But when Karen raised her hand to speak, she presented something no one could have predicted. With a dramatic tone, she announced her proposal: the removal of the Golden Gate Bridge. The room fell silent. At first, people thought she was joking. But she wasn't. She went on to explain that the bridge no longer served the community and was outdated. She argued that it brought nothing but noise, pollution, and unwanted outsiders. She insisted the city had the power to take it down and replace it with something more modern and tasteful, something that aligned with her vision of the neighborhood. Neighbors whispered in disbelief. Some laughed nervously. Others sat in stunned silence, unsure how to even respond to such an outrageous demand. But Karen was serious. She promised she would take her crusade all the way to the city board if necessary. And that's exactly what she did. Within days, she began filing complaints, bombarding city officials with letters, and even circulating petitions around the neighborhood. The petition, unsurprisingly, was met with ridicule. Most refused to sign it. Some even tore it up in front of her. Yet Karen persisted, believing she could wear people down through sheer determination. The local homeowners association, of which Karen was a loud and active member, suddenly found itself dragged into the middle of this absurd battle. She pressured the HOA to support her initiative under the guise of protecting property values. She claimed the bridge's constant traffic lowered the peace and serenity of their community. Of course, the HOA board didn't have the power to influence city infrastructure on such a grand scale, but Karen wasn't interested in reason. She was interested in power. This is where the story truly began to spiral. Karen's obsession grew. She started attending every public forum, raising her voice louder than anyone else, demanding the bridge's removal. She framed it as a matter of community rights, twisting her narrative to make it sound like she was speaking for everyone, when in truth, she was only speaking for herself. But as she pushed harder, she failed to see the storm she was stirring. Because in San Francisco, the Golden Gate Bridge wasn't just a structure, it was an icon tied to people's identities, memories, and even livelihoods. Her campaign against it didn't just annoy people. It enraged them. News of her bizarre crusade began to spread. At first, it was whispers between neighbors. Then, local blogs picked up the story. Before long, it made its way onto larger platforms, painting Karen as the woman who wanted to take down the Golden Gate Bridge. And while she thought the attention gave her momentum, it was actually setting her up for a backlash she couldn't imagine. Behind the scenes, people were growing restless. Longtime residents were offended by her arrogance. Business owners feared for their livelihoods. Families who cherished their weekend walks across the bridge were furious at the thought of losing it because of one entitled neighbor. And as this resentment simmered, plans were already forming for how to stop Karen in her tracks. Karen believed she had power. She thought persistence alone would bend the city to her will. But she didn't yet realize that she was up against something bigger than herself. The pride, unity, and determination of a community unwilling to let her erase their history. The first cracks in her plan were about to appear, and once they did, there would be no turning back. The story of Karen's crusade against the Golden Gate Bridge spread faster than she expected. What she had believed would be a noble campaign to protect the community quickly became the subject of jokes, ridicule, and outrage. On social media, people mocked her demands, creating memes with captions like, "Karen vs. the Golden Gate," and "Good luck tearing down steel with a complaint form." At first, Karen relished the attention. She saw her name circulating and mistook mockery for notoriety. She believed that if enough people were talking about her, eventually her cause would be taken seriously. But in reality, she was feeding a fire that would burn her carefully crafted image to ashes. It didn't take long before the city officials grew tired of her constant letters and petitions. Every week, her complaints filled their inboxes, wasting valuable time that could have been spent addressing real concerns, like housing, traffic, and safety. Instead, they were forced to entertain the rantings of a single resident who believed the Golden Gate Bridge was a neighborhood nuisance. But the true turning point came when Karen tried to bring the HOA into her mission. She demanded that the Homeowners Association formally back her petition. The board, initially cautious, declined, explaining that they had no authority over a federal landmark. But Karen wouldn't take no for an answer. She stormed into meetings, interrupted discussions about routine maintenance, and refused to let other voices be heard. To her, the bridge had become an obsession, and the HOA board was simply another tool to be wielded. Neighbors, however, were growing restless. Families who once tolerated her interruptions now began to view her as a threat. Local business owners who relied on tourism from the bridge saw her efforts as an attack on their livelihoods. The longer Karen pushed, the more she alienated herself. And then came the first protest. It wasn't organized by politicians or officials, it was organized by ordinary residents. People gathered with signs reading, "Save our bridge" and "Hands off our history." Families marched together, business owners handed out flyers, and even schoolchildren painted posters showing the bridge with messages of pride. The protest wasn't massive, but it was powerful enough to send a clear message: the community was united, and they were ready to fight. Karen, however, viewed the protest as a personal attack. She claimed the people were being manipulated, and that her opponents were afraid of change. Instead of reflecting on her mistakes, she doubled down. She began spreading exaggerated claims, saying the bridge was unsafe, falling apart, and a danger to the community. She hoped that fear would sway more people to her side. But this tactic backfired spectacularly. City engineers publicly refuted her claims, releasing reports that the bridge was structurally sound and well-maintained. Instead of weakening support for the bridge, Karen's falsehood strengthened it. People now viewed her not just as entitled, but dishonest. The pressure mounted when local news stations began covering the feud. Reporters filmed residents defending the bridge while highlighting Karen's campaign as an oddity. On camera, she appeared defiant, convinced she was leading a righteous cause. But behind the scenes, more and more people were rallying against her. What Karen failed to understand was that the Golden Gate Bridge wasn't just a structure, it was a symbol that touched countless lives. Couples had proposed there. Families had taken photos against its backdrop. Veterans remembered returning home beneath its towers. To attempt to erase it wasn't just an inconvenience. It was an insult to the city's identity. The second protest dwarfed the first. Hundreds of residents gathered near the bridge, chanting, marching, and showing their solidarity. Local businesses donated banners and refreshments. Tourists joined in, eager to defend a landmark they had traveled miles to see. The message was clear: Karen might have started a fight, but she was outnumbered 1,000 to 1. Yet Karen still refused to back down. The more people opposed her, the more stubborn she became. She believed that if she pushed hard enough, eventually someone in authority would cave to avoid the noise she created. But what she didn't realize was that she was no longer just fighting neighbors. She was fighting the entire city, and the city was preparing to make an example out of her. Because while Karen thought she was winning battles by staying loud, she hadn't yet seen the war that was brewing. Officials were gathering records. Neighbors were digging into her past. And soon, cracks would begin to show, not in the bridge, but in Karen's own credibility. The stage was set for her downfall, and when it came, it would be louder than any protest, harsher than any letter, and far more permanent than she could imagine. The fight over the Golden Gate Bridge had escalated beyond anyone's imagination. What began as one woman's complaint had snowballed into a citywide conflict, with protests, news coverage, and even heated debates on national talk shows. Everywhere Karen turned, people were talking about her crusade. But instead of admiration, it was contempt. She had become a symbol, not of change, but of arrogance. The city officials had tolerated her antics long enough. The letters, the petitions, the rants at public meetings, all had wasted precious time. But once Karen began spreading lies about the bridge's safety, officials decided enough was enough. They launched a formal review, not of the bridge, but of Karen herself. Her public comments had raised questions, and the city wanted to know why one resident was pushing so aggressively for something so irrational. At the same time, neighbors had started doing their own digging. They remembered how Karen always complained about the rules but never seemed to follow them herself. The HOA had long tolerated her disruptive behavior, but now, with the spotlight on her, people started asking questions. And what they found was explosive. Karen, who had claimed the Golden Gate Bridge was an eyesore, had multiple code violations on her own property. Her backyard shed had been built without a permit. She had painted her house a garish, non-approved color, ignoring the HOA's design rules. She had even been caught operating a small business out of her home, something strictly against community bylaws. The hypocrisy was staggering. While she demanded the demolition of a national landmark under the guise of rules and community standards, she herself had been breaking those very standards for years. Word spread quickly. Soon, the very same neighbors she had tried to manipulate were armed with evidence of her misconduct. At the next HOA meeting, instead of listening to her rants about the bridge, people confronted her with questions about her violations. Her confident facade began to crack. She stammered, dodged questions, and tried to change the subject. But the more she resisted, the more people pressed. Then came the breaking point. Local reporters uncovered her violations as well. They ran stories not just about the woman who wanted the Golden Gate Bridge removed, but about the hypocrisy behind the crusade. Suddenly, Karen wasn't just mocked for her ridiculous demands, she was exposed as a fraud. The backlash was immediate and brutal. Residents who had once ignored her antics now demanded action. The HOA board was flooded with complaints, not about the bridge, but about Karen. People demanded fines, enforcement, and even her removal from the community. Karen lashed out, claiming it was all a smear campaign. She said her neighbors were out to get her and that the city was covering up the truth. But no one believed her anymore. Her credibility had been destroyed, and every attempt to fight back only dug her hole deeper. Meanwhile, the city officials had grown tired of the distraction. They held a public forum, inviting both sides to speak. Residents lined up to defend the Golden Gate Bridge, sharing emotional stories about what it meant to them, their family traditions, their childhood memories, their pride in their city. Karen stood alone, her arguments drowned out by a wave of unity and love for the landmark. By the end of the forum, it was clear, Karen had no support left. The city officially declared the Golden Gate Bridge a protected historic structure, reaffirming its importance and making it nearly impossible for any individual to challenge it again. It was a victory for the people and a crushing defeat for Karen. But the story wasn't over. Because while Karen had lost her fight against the bridge, the consequences of her hypocrisy were still unfolding. The HOA was preparing action. Fines were piling up. And whispers of legal trouble loomed on the horizon. For Karen, the battle had shifted. She had tried to tear down the Golden Gate Bridge, but now, the very community she claimed to represent was preparing to tear down her reputation, her comfort, and possibly even her place in the neighborhood. The final chapter of her downfall was approaching, and it would be harsher than anything she had ever tried to unleash on the bridge. The fight over the Golden Gate Bridge was over. The people had spoken, the city had spoken, and the world had spoken. The bridge stood tall, more admired than ever before, while Karen's name became synonymous with arrogance and failure. But for her, the nightmare was only beginning. The HOA, which had once tolerated her disruptive behavior, had reached its breaking point. Karen had embarrassed not only herself but the entire community. Her constant complaints, her endless drama, and now her blatant hypocrisy had poisoned the neighborhood's reputation. Residents no longer viewed her as just a nuisance, they saw her as a threat. The board moved quickly. They launched a formal review of her property, cataloging every violation. The illegally built shed, the unapproved paint color, the home-based business, all were cited, each with hefty fines attached. The numbers quickly piled up, creating a debt Karen couldn't easily dismiss. She ranted that it was revenge for her bravery, but her neighbors no longer listened. They wanted accountability, and they weren't going to let her escape. At the same time, the media attention had intensified. While the Golden Gate Bridge had always been a symbol of resilience, Karen became a symbol of reckless entitlement. Reporters followed her story relentlessly, exposing every detail of her hypocrisy. Viral videos mocked her speeches, turning her outbursts into internet memes. Strangers from across the country commented on her behavior, calling her the Karen who tried to cancel the Golden Gate Bridge. The pressure weighed heavily on her. Friends she once leaned on began to distance themselves. Even those who had quietly tolerated her antics before refused to be associated with her now. She was isolated, ridiculed, and drowning under the weight of her own actions. But the final blow came not from the public or even the HOA, but from the law itself. When city investigators reviewed her false claims about the bridge's safety, they discovered that she had knowingly fabricated reports and misrepresented data. These actions crossed a line. What had begun as a nuisance now had legal consequences. She was charged with filing false claims and obstructing city business. The trial wasn't dramatic, it was humiliating. The evidence was clear, and the outcome was inevitable. Karen was found guilty and ordered to pay restitution to the city for the wasted resources her campaign had consumed. On top of the HOA fines and mounting legal fees, her financial stability crumbled. She was forced to sell her house, leaving the very neighborhood she had once dominated with her voice and complaints. As for the Golden Gate Bridge, it stood proudly, untouched and unshaken. In fact, the controversy only strengthened its place in the hearts of the people. Tourists flocked to see it, locals rallied around it, and the city held a commemorative event celebrating its resilience. The bridge had survived earthquakes, storms, and now, the wrath of one determined Karen. For the community, Karen's downfall was more than justice, it was a lesson. A reminder that no individual, no matter how loud or entitled, could erase something that belonged to everyone. The bridge was more than steel and concrete, it was history, memory, and unity. And no single person could ever take that away. Karen, once determined to remove the Golden Gate Bridge, had instead removed herself from the city's story. Her voice was silenced, her reputation ruined, and her legacy reduced to a cautionary tale told in whispers and videos across the internet. In the end, the people had won. The Golden Gate Bridge still stood, not just as an icon of engineering but as a symbol of resilience against arrogance and entitlement. The city had faced a storm, but unity had prevailed. And so, while the bridge continued to carry thousands across its mighty span each day, Karen faded into obscurity, her attempt at rewriting history remembered only as one of the most infamous HOA dramas of all time.